Russia and Ukraine are taking heavy casualties in the Donbas. But has Ukraine already lost the east? My guest this week believes that is likely the case. Ian Bremmer is a political scientist and founder of the Eurasia Group.
It is very clear that the cost that Russia is going to pay economically, politically, and strategically for a generation or more will be very severe, and we can't forget about that.
And we also discuss the impact of a conflict that has had a broader effect on global stability. All this and more on this week's Conflict Zone. Ian Bremmer, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Happy to join you.
Now, the battle for Ukraine is slowly, dangerously close to becoming a frozen conflict. Ukraine is facing 10 times the number of artillery guns it has, according to some reports, losing up to 200 soldiers a day. And Russia is making small but incremental gains. Could Ukraine be on the verge of losing the Donbas?
It's certainly losing most of the Donbas. It's hard to imagine that they would be able to retake the territory that would bring them back to the pre-February 24th lines of conflict. And I think that those are minimum table stakes for an effective negotiation. So, I mean, what we're looking at is a situation where the Russians are increasingly able to declare victory in their much more modest and scaled down war aims from this so-called second phase of the special military operations, the Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as the land bridge to Crimea. But of course, Russia's position globally is vastly worse. They're losing the war against Europe, the war against the U.S., the war against NATO.
Let's just stay with the situation in Ukraine for a moment. I do want to discuss Europe, but let's just talk about Ukraine for a second. Russia clearly has the numerical advantage, and as you mentioned, it is declaring these small wins in the eastern regions. What needs to happen to tip the balance in Ukraine's favor?
Well, Russia's defense spending is 10 times that of Ukraine's on an annual basis. Now, the extraordinary amount of international support has narrowed that gap this year. And there's no question that the morale of the Ukrainian troops fighting for their homeland, fighting for their families, fighting for their existence also provides advantages to the Ukrainians that the Russians cannot bring to the front. But it's still David versus Goliath. And now that the Russians are focusing almost all of their troops on a much more compact area, it's honestly hard to imagine that the Ukrainians are going to be able to stop them. It's certainly true that if the West were to provide heavier weapons faster in the coming weeks, that maybe they could prevent the Russians from taking even more territory. Luhansk is basically done. Donetsk, maybe they can stop.
So why isn't the West providing heavier weapons the way Ukraine has been pleading since at least April? Why is the pace of delivery so slow?
In the case, the United States has been responsible for the lion's share of the defense support so far. And in some cases, it's because there's a reluctance to provide the heaviest weapons for fear of escalating the war beyond Ukraine's borders. That definitely, and by the way, the Europeans felt the same way. No, we're not sending tanks, then maybe we'll send tanks. We're not sending helicopters, maybe we'll send helicopters. So, I mean, there has been a shift in the perspective of different NATO countries over the last 4 months. Some of it, honestly, is that the Americans don't suddenly, it's not like they have a whole bunch of surplus weaponry that they've just been sitting on and doing nothing with. In some cases, they are actually sending what they have available, and there needs to be increased production. So I think both of those things are going on right now.
Now, the U.S. has recently announced a further $1 billion in military assistance for Ukraine. The U.K. has announced a fast-track training program for Ukrainian troops. Will this pick up the pace of heavy weapons deliveries to Ukraine?
Yeah, but I don't think that this is not going to fundamentally change my view that the Russians are likely to be able to take most, if not all, of the Donbas, and also likely maintain their control of the land bridge to Crimea, including the city of Kherson.
Now, Ukrainian President Zelensky has warned that Ukraine is facing increased attacks from Russia, while the European Union considers whether to admit Ukraine into the EU family or not. So these heavy weapons that Ukraine wants aren't coming to Ukraine. And then there is the reality, as you mentioned, that Russia is likely to take control of the Donbas. What is Ukraine supposed to do? How is it supposed to withstand this renewed Russian onslaught?
Well, the extraordinary amount of support that the West has provided for Ukraine, let's be clear, it's vastly greater than anyone would have expected. If you had said that the Russians are going to invade on February 24th, I don't think any external analyst would have expected the billions and billions of dollars that have been provided. But I want to be clear, this is not only about Ukraine withstanding an attack from a country that can marshal 10 times its own military and defense forces. It's also about punishing the Russians. And if the Russians are going to continue to engage in war crimes, they're going to continue to invade an innocent country for no reason other than the fact they want to choose their own government, then the Russians are going to be permanently cut off from the Western economy. And those level of sanctions are greater than anything we've ever seen applied against the G20 economy. Now, that doesn't save Ukraine. That doesn't save the millions of Ukrainian refugees. That doesn't make the Donbas suddenly Ukrainian. I accept that. But it is very clear that the cost that Russia is going to pay economically, politically, and strategically for a generation or more will be very severe, and we can't forget about that.
Okay, let's look at punishing the Russians. You talked about punishing the Russians. Let's look at the short term. You were talking about the long term here. President Macron of France had earlier said that Russia should not be humiliated, and then he was in Kyiv with other EU leaders, and he talks about Ukraine winning, saying Ukraine must win. What do you think changed on the ground that made President Macron say what he said? What changed that the massacres in Bucha and Irpin could not force him to say that Ukraine must win?
Look, I think that this whole Russia must not be humiliated, it's an exciting statement that makes great headlines and is differentiated from Biden, and that's why we talk about it a lot. But, you know, France has been sending weapons to Ukraine. And France has been a leader in 6 rounds of unprecedented European sanctions against Russia. The reality of France's position on Russia and Ukraine is virtually identical to Germany's. It's virtually identical to that of the Biden administration. Now, look, I believe that Putin shouldn't be humiliated. The only problem is that the person that's doing most of the humiliating of Putin is Putin. And, you know, there's a very easy way for Putin to stop being humiliated, and that is to pull his troops out of Ukraine and back to the borders that had been, at the very least, at an absolute minimum, where the Russians were on February 23rd. Which, frankly, I mean, even that is unacceptable, given that they're still occupying Ukrainian territory. But that would be the fastest way for Putin to end his humiliation. I think that Macron understands that.
So is that what Ukraine winning looks like? So when Macron says Ukraine must win, is that what he means?
I don't think it will feel like a win to the Ukrainian people. I think that when you have hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that are in filtration camps in Russia, abducted and taken away from their country against their will, when you have tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians that have been killed in cold blood inside Ukraine, when you have pieces of their territory including the informally occupied territory of the Donbas and Crimea that Russia still sits on. You've got millions of refugees in the homes of Europeans outside of Ukraine. This is a level of personal tragedy that every single Ukrainian will feel. And frankly, I think it will be the most important historic part of their lives for generations. And so I don't know how you can live through that. I don't know how you can live through that.
So in the short term, there is no win for Ukraine. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that I don't believe, look, I come from partially an Armenian family, and I don't think anyone that's been through the Armenian genocide can say that they won during that period. And I think from the Ukrainians that I've met, both in and out of the government over the last few months, these are traumatized people, personally, deeply traumatized people. I don't think that it's appropriate to speak of Ukraine winning after experiencing that.
Now, the Institute for the Study of War in a June 11 assessment was quoting Ukrainian intelligence, and it said that Russia is planning to prolong the war till at least October this year, if not longer. I'm wondering what that does for the one thing that you said Ukraine has going for it, its morale.
I think that, again, the Ukrainians are fighting for survival. And I think, as we saw from people that lived through the Nazi era, that fighting for survival means fighting as long as it takes. So I think that you'll find that Ukrainian morale on the ground, the troops, will continue to be shockingly high. But I just don't think they'll have the resources to continue to fight the way they have against the Russians over the first 3 months of this conflict, when they pushed the Russians out of the surrounding areas of Kiev, out of the surrounding areas of Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. I just think, this is a David versus Goliath story, and you can't realistically expect that Ukrainians can keep that up for years. Let's be clear.
What about Europe? Boris Johnson is warning of Ukraine fatigue. Can Europe match Putin's resolve if this war stretches out?
No, they can't match Putin's resolve in Ukraine, but they can absolutely overmatch Putin's resolve for everything else. Let's keep in mind that the longer this war goes on, the more the Russians are going to be advantaged in Ukraine, but the more they will be disadvantaged in terms of their leverage over Europe. Once the Europeans no longer need Russian coal, they're not going back. Russian oil, they're not going back. Russian gas, they're not going back. The longer the time of this war goes on, the less reliance the Europeans have on the Russian economy.
But then Russia is finding new customers in China and India, for instance.
Yes, that's right. There are customers in China and India. The Indians are buying more oil. They're not buying more Russian weapons, because you don't want to buy helicopters when they don't have spare parts. And of course, a big part of Russia's economy was they were the second largest military exporter in the world. That will go away because they will no longer have that capacity. The Europeans are talking about boycotting your shipping services, insurance and reinsurance. That's 90% of all shipping of oil that comes out of Russia, irrespective of where it goes, whether Europe or other places. And of course, even with the Indians, the Chinese buying more oil at high prices, the IMF expectation of Russian GDP contraction this year is over 10%. And I have some sources inside Moscow that believe that it's closer to 15%. That's pretty severe. I think anyone would argue that's a Greece-style depression that the West is enforcing, that Europe is enforcing against Russia.
But none of that is of any consolation to the Ukrainians who are looking at losing the Donbas and potentially the south of Ukraine.
Not just that. None of that's any consolation to the Ukrainians who have had 6 million refugees, who have had war crimes committed against them, and the Russians that have committed those war crimes that are back in Russia have impunity. So again, I would argue with you that that you're not going to provide satisfaction to a country of 44 million people that has been unjustly invaded.
Now, Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda said in March, I'd like to quote him, Putin will not stop in Ukraine if he will not be stopped. And now we have Russia demanding Lithuania stop enforcing EU sanctions that prohibit the transit of Russian goods into the enclave of Kaliningrad.
Kaliningrad, yeah.
Could this escalate? Is something going to happen in Kaliningrad or Lithuania?
Well, the Russians have said it will escalate. But let's keep in mind that Lithuania, like all the Baltics, are NATO states. And if they're invaded, that would lead to a NATO response. I don't think that the Russians, given the challenges they're having on the ground in Ukraine, are particularly eager for a second front in that war. So I expect that Russia's escalation will be largely symbolic. I think there have been some signs of that in the last 24 hours. Look, the Lithuanians are plenty angry at Russia. And like most of Europe, they are fully on board with the unprecedented tough sanctions that are being leveled.
But should the Baltic nations and other Eastern European countries be preparing for war?
It is a wartime. And by the way, I should make the argument that if the Europeans are about to provide candidate member status to Ukraine, then that will mean that the European Union will be directly at war with Russia, right? I mean, that's kind of what they're saying. So, I mean, I think that the Europeans are preparing for war. It's a cold war right now, but there are elements of hot war, espionage, cyber attacks, disinformation. It's a very dangerous time. This is existential for Europe.
We've seen Eastern European countries particularly and the Baltic nations generally on one side of NATO, generally on the same page when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And on the other extreme, you have Western nations, Western European nations like France and Germany. How do you view France and Germany? Are they essentially in the business of appeasing Russia at the moment?
I think that's an incredible misread. Anyone that would say that, I'm not suggesting you're saying that. I know you're just asking the question. I mean, yes, there are differences, nuanced differences between Poland wanting to provide more heavy weapons, for example, and France and Germany a little bit more reluctant. But the overwhelming message that the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians have delivered in the last months has been support for Ukraine. It's been direct defense support, it's been humanitarian support, and it's been 6 rounds of sanctions. And the Europeans, of course, are taking it on the chin. I mean, the Hungarians aren't completely on board, and Serbia, which is not a member of the EU, is not on board. But overwhelmingly, the Europeans have been sticking together here. And the idea, anyone that would argue that the French and the Germans are trying to appease the Russians, either they're Russian propagandists and not admitting it to you, or they're being dishonest.
Jens Stoltenberg has said that the war will most likely end at the negotiating table, and what happens there will be determined effectively by the situation on the battlefield. So you do believe that Germany and France are doing everything they can to make sure that Ukraine has a strong negotiating position at those talks, if and when they happen?
No, of course I don't believe that. Neither are the Americans, neither are the Poles. I mean, there's no no-fly zone. I saw the Polish government was willing to provide aircraft for a no-fly zone as long as they didn't have to send it directly. So the Polish government isn't doing everything they can. I don't see the Poles sending troops to fight side by side with Ukraine, even though the Polish government has told me that they consider the Ukrainians fighting for Poland, fighting so that the Poles don't have to. So no one would argue that they're doing everything they can. But they're certainly doing much more than anyone would have expected, and they're working together, which I think is very important.
Now, the Italians presented a ceasefire plan in May, and point 3 of that 4-point plan essentially put the Donbas, the state of the Donbas and Crimea up for discussion with Russia. Do you get the impression that Western Europe is happy to sacrifice Donbas and Crimea if it puts a stop to the war?
No. I get the sense that Western Europe believes that the Ukrainian government are the principal negotiators. They've been the ones fighting. They've been the ones dying. They've been the ones suffering. And it was very clear when the French president, the Italian prime minister, the German chancellor, and the Romanian president, for fun, all showed up in Kiev last week. And they all made it very clear that any negotiation that will ever occur with Putin will be led by the Ukrainians. And that is, of course, the appropriate position.
Now, you had said in an interview to DW, to a colleague of mine at the Munich Security Conference, that Russia wants to find ways to divide NATO. What you're saying is Russia has failed.
That's right. Russia has actually, Putin has succeeded in uniting and strengthening NATO in ways that American presidents had only dreamed of. I mean, Trump failed, Biden failed, Obama failed. They couldn't get the Germans to spend 2% on defense. They couldn't get the French and Swedes to say, the Finns and Swedes to say they wanted to join. They couldn't do permanent deployments, forward deployments. They couldn't get the Europeans to recognize that their peace dividend did not mean that they could ignore national security. Putin has accomplished all of those things and more for NATO. So absolutely, Putin has succeeded in strengthening NATO. I don't think that was his intention, but he has succeeded.
Speaking of U.S. presidents, under President Donald Trump, he initially withheld $400 million in the military aid package to Ukraine over a quid pro quo to do with Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. And this was in the middle of a conflict that was raging in Ukraine's east. Did an action like this enable Putin and his ambitions in Ukraine?
No, not really. Though you remember, it is true that Trump was impeached a second time for that action. Of course, he wasn't convicted because impeachment is broken as a political process in the United States. But it speaks volumes that he was impeached for that. The fact is that Putin decided to invade for a number of reasons. When Putin met with Biden a year ago in Switzerland, it was largely Biden's agenda. Biden was talking mostly about cyber attacks because the Colonial Pipeline hit. He did not put Ukraine high on the agenda. Putin surely noticed that. He thought Biden was comparatively weak, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal, thought the United States was focusing more on China, as they were, saw that Merkel was out. Merkel was the one that, of course, was much more hard line in terms of Ukraine specifically and much more focused on the Donbas and on the Minsk Accords accordingly, saw that Macron was going in his own direction, saw that Xi Jinping was his best friend on the global stage, and of course also saw that Russia had much more energy and gas influence over Europe as winter was coming.
I'd just like to talk about the United States over here. It was Trump who initially pulled away funding from Ukraine, but then released it. And then you had in May, just this May, 11 Republicans in the Senate and I think it was 57 in the House who voted against the $40 billion package of funding for Ukraine. If Trump was withholding money, there seems to be a mood to do that now as well, isn't there?
A mood. Well, I mean, given that this is one of the most bipartisan packages that had gotten support in the United States, I mean, the Americans agree on nothing right now, Democrats and Republicans. The amount of support, overwhelming majorities in the House and Senate for $40 billion for Ukraine, a country most of them hadn't heard of before February 24th, is a staggering amount of support. I mean, it is true that you can find a few people that weren't in favor of it, but actually the Biden administration only wanted $33 billion, and Republicans demanded more.
How long will this support hold? I just wanted to quote a poll by NPR PBS that said that President Biden's ratings are down over his handling of Ukraine, and the number one concern amongst most Americans is inflation. Prices are going up, and most of them believe that Republicans can do a better job of reining in inflation than the Democrats. My indication is, what does this mean for the midterm polls that are coming up?
Oh, no, look, Biden's going to get destroyed in the midterms and the Democrats will lose the House. But I am incredulous that you found a poll that said that Biden's numbers are going down because of Ukraine. Americans do not know hardly anything about Ukraine. They don't vote on the basis of Ukraine. They're going down because of inflation.
So how much will Ukraine be a priority November onwards in the United States?
Oh, I mean, the United States is already losing interest in Ukraine. That's pretty clear. It's hard for me to imagine that you're going to get the same kind of support for Ukraine next year as you got this year. But I promise you that you'll get the same kind of punishment of Russia that you got this year. So once again, I mean, it's going to be harder for Ukraine in 2023, but Russia's going to take it in the teeth. And Putin's not going to look like a winner here. He's going to look like he's been absolutely destroyed by the West. But
that works for Putin, doesn't it? Because he gets to consolidate his positions in Ukraine. And for him, that counts as a win. And there is no guarantee he does not threaten any other European country.
If I were advising Putin, and look, please don't wish that upon me. Clearly, I would tell him to try to announce his Ukraine territory as a win, but his economy is being contracted. He can't. His athletes can't compete under the Russian flag. His oligarchs are having their assets frozen. Half of his central bank assets have been unprecedentedly frozen. NATO is expanding. The Finnish border is an unprecedented expansion. I mean, if he said this was all about NATO before he invaded Ukraine, and as I said, and as you certainly understand, NATO has gotten a lot stronger. I mean, no matter, Putin can paint this however he wants. This is an unmitigated disaster for Putin.
Ian Bremmer, that's about all we have time for. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you so much for being on Conflict Zone.
Sure. Good to see you.